Hi everybody, I will be doing my critical analysis of the R2D2 model. So let's get started with the model overview. So a brief overview, and then we'll get into more details in a couple of slides. The Recursive and Reflective Design and Development, or R2D2 model, is an instructional design model by Jerry Willis that was created to reflect the values and themes of constructivist approaches in regard to learning. So up until recently, most instructional design models and processes were linear, and they focused more on attempting to generalize instructional approaches as opposed to focusing more on specific context, which is what the R2D2 strives to do. There are three basic principles of the R2D2 model. The first is recursion, the second is reflection, and the third is participatory design. So recursion, it is a circular process with this model where things are happening at any point in the process, and that there's not one single step that is first and then something that has to happen after. Reflection is important because they're constantly reviewing, and it is encouraged to reflect throughout the whole process as opposed to at specific points. And the last being participatory design. So it's a very collaborative design process as opposed to focusing on one expert designer leading a team. So let's talk about the theories behind it. So Jerry Willis follows a constructivist approach to instructional design. So constructivist instructional design, or CID, goes against traditional approaches that align more closely with behaviorism and cognitivism. Constructivism was popularized by Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget, so he focused his learning theory more on child development education, but it still can apply to instructional design and the processes. So the quote on the top, I think, is a really great way to see the constructivist theory being molded into his model. Instructional design at this point is much more art than science. So this approach really is about more intuition and using the context environments to create solutions as opposed to taking a generalized theory and just applying it to the problem. So this is a really good visual from Willis himself, kind of describing the differences between the more objective driven ID models and then the constructivist approach. So what is it? Is it a model, a framework, or an approach? So even though Willis states that it's a model in the title, I still wanted to do some digging, and so I put into Google definitions of a model. So one was a system or a thing used as an example to follow or imitate. Another was a simplified description, especially a mathematical one, of a system or process to assist calculations and predictions. So even though this is not a mathematical model, it is a simplified description of steps, though in this case they're nonlinear, to assist in making decisions in the instructional design process. For the first definition, I wouldn't apply the word imitate in this situation because the main focus of this model tends to be contextual, and no one instructional designer would apply this model similarly in different contexts. So let's talk about the model's focuses. So Willis divides his model into three major focuses. These could be called steps, but we'll just call them focuses. The first is to define. The second is design and development. And the third is dissemination. So in the image here, we do see the three focuses in what is called the impossible triangle. So it's kind of M.C. Escher-esque, where you can see whichever angle you approach, you can access the other focuses or the other steps. That you don't have to start in one particular spot. So let's talk about each of these into a little bit more detail. So the approach of creating a participatory group eliminates the common upfront activities such as the learner, task, and concept analysis, as well as the creation of instructional objectives. However, I wonder, does it really get rid of these steps? In a way, I think it does, but at the same time, these steps that would happen in traditional approaches are happening in a different way. The second is progressive problem solution. So the traditional ID models can be said to tackle one step at a time before moving on to the next. Feedback loops occur when you get feedback on the product of that stage before moving on to the next. So in the R2D2 model, Willis strives to avoid these feedback loops or reframe how we view it. Quote, process of progressively solving multiple problems in context, unquote. So these solutions emerge during the complete design process as opposed to being done initially, as is the case with most traditional models. The last is developing phronesis or contextual understanding. So many traditional models, quote, are based on the assumption that there is much that can be generalized, unquote. So basically what works for one type of instructional context must work for another based on these similar objectives in learners. This approach is completely the opposite. It is very focused on the specific contexts, the specific learners, and trying to create objectives based on those learners and objectives based on those contexts. The second is design and development. So the R2D2 model does not separate design and development as most other models do. Part of the reason for this that Willis states is due to technology advancements. So we're more easily able to develop and make changes quickly compared to in prior times where you had to maybe change code, for example, in a computer software. So things are a little bit faster to update. So he just lumps these together. So the first is selection of a development environment, which focuses on the tools of the design, what's needed to create and design. That could be from charts to video editing to authoring environments to even just lesson plans. And the second is the process of design. So this is kind of determining if it's component design, single path prototype, creating an alpha version of beta. So this is more of a traditional approach to design. Cooperative inquiry is another big part of design and development. So it used to be formative evaluation in the previous R2D2 model that Willis had created, but he decided to change the name just to make a distinction between other models and his. So in other models, it's considered to be a truth about the right way to do something. And in R2D2, it's based around the participatory team deciding on a local truth based on their context. So, quote, members of the team cooperatively research and reflect, improving the material being developed, unquote. And this is something that's happening constantly through the process. So product design and development. Willis doesn't go into too much detail about this section on how to design the products, but he does provide some general themes for the section. So, quote, R2D2 process can be used to create a wide variety of educational materials. The way you think about the product will, however, vary from job to job. So again, this is really situational and context focused, which is the main theme and overarching paradigm. Dissemination is the final portion. So it's the final packaging of the product, so diffusing and adoption of the product into different contexts, whether that is helping teachers understand the product and helping them use it in their specific classrooms, and then just making any final adjustments. I'm now going to talk about a few of the criteria and analyze those a little bit. So let's start with knowledge. So what type of knowledge is it? I think that the R2D2 model is mainly focused on procedural type of knowledge. The main idea of the process in the model is that you're constantly revising and analyzing the process. Unlike other models and processes, this focus is not on learning theories and why they promote a certain instructional design method for those contexts. Instead, it's just on the process of how to get to the end result through the use of those team members and stakeholders. So instructional contexts. I think that this is more for corporate settings, professional development, and training environments. After doing another review of the materials, I do believe you can use it in maybe higher education, but it's a very vague model and it's a little bit hard to pinpoint, I think, what it should be used for. I don't see this working as appropriately in a K through 12 type of environment or places that have specific content goals that must be met, especially with standardized testing. There's not as much flexibility for those learning objectives. What type of expertise is required? When I initially did this in our discussion post, I had said novice and intermediate. I still think this holds true a little bit, but after doing a thorough examination of the model, I think it leans more towards expert. This model does require people to be intuitive, and experienced designers are needed to carry out this because there's a lack of quote-unquote steps. I think that it goes along with the model being instructional design viewed as an art. That one could argue that people who have more experience in instructional design bring a lot more to the table, and they have the experience from prior projects they've worked on, prior contexts, that they can pull that into it without relying on theory. Whereas novice instructional designers might just be basing their work on the models they learned in school or just on a couple of projects. So I think the hardest part is that it is flexible and you're constantly revising and it's not a linear process. So I do think that it's actually more required for expert designers and perhaps some intermediate. In terms of content that it needs to be, content experts, you don't really have to have those as much because you have that team of stakeholders that are involved. So I'm going to talk about the strengths and limits. So let's look at some of the strengths. So one of them is that you can catch problems earlier than other models. It's quick to fix when you're constantly revising. So that is from Gomol in regard to the Apple computers. So quote, she says, by observing users early and often, we have been able to catch problems in the prototype stage rather than waiting until just before the product ships. So I think with this model, when you're constantly revising, when something's wrong, you fix it immediately and you don't let it get to that end stage where you have to go back and do extra work and change something that affects X, Y, Z. The second one is that a collaborative team means more knowledge. So I think having a diverse and a experienced team, you have the designer, you have maybe a policymaker for a company, you have a supervisor who's going to be carrying out a training, you have teachers, you have students, you're getting ideas and input from every which way in regard to the learning issue at hand. And I think lastly, this is a very learner-focused or user-centered model, and it's definitely aligning more and more with like the 21st century practices that we have. Technology is more prevalent and it's used in instruction. And I think technology has so many possibilities to explore and to encourage more learner-focused design and learner-encouraged design, I guess, and focusing on the learner and giving them empowerment in their own learning. Some of the limitations are kind of, this goes with it's a strength. Unsupported teams can create issues. So having a diverse team is great if it's supported properly and everyone's working together and you have a strong sense of collaboration. If you have a team where people are coming from different angles and no one's agreeing, then it's going to create more issues than it's going to solve. The second one I briefly talked about with the required expertise. It's a challenging model to use and I think to apply. You do have to have a certain amount of knowledge under your belt already about instructional design, perhaps. And as I do believe that teaching to a certain extent can be an art form and that a lot of it is an intuitive process. So I think that is very challenging and could be a limitation, that you're not able to apply this to most or to many instructional designers. And another one that could be seen as a limitation is that it's too flexible of a model to maybe even consider it a model. So some criticisms of the model were that the steps actually are pretty linear in nature. It's just disguised in a different way. So these are some of the limitations. Overall, I think there's more strengths to talk about than limitations, but the ones that we have here are pretty major, in my opinion. So to wrap things up, the R2D2 model strives to create a collaborative instructional design process that focuses on contextual environments by including the stakeholders in that participatory design team. The steps, or the focuses, can occur in any order, and the design process is recursive and circular in nature. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I had a really fun time putting it together. And here is my references.